Reviewing this footage, it's hard to believe I shot this. Here I am scud running along at 1,500 feet above ground in barely 3-mile visibility, and it got worse before I got to my destination. So how did a safe and conscientious pilot, such as myself, get into this situation? Bear with me as I walk you through what should have been a routine flight, but ended up being the closest call that I've ever had, nearly flying VFR into IMC conditions. At the time of this flight, I'd had over 15 years of experience flying VFR, and I'd never pushed my limits near the legal weather minimums. However, after this flight, I was inspired to take on the challenge of IFR training. This close call motivated me to at least get the training for the added safety buffer. So it started with a day that was reported to be good VFR with a brisk but acceptable north wind. I had done my due diligence and checked the weather and the NOTAMs online, and I'd even done an official weather briefing over the phone. I'd be flying with a pilot buddy that I regularly fly with. The plan was a bit of a mission of sorts, so it added some pressure to me to schedule, but we were up for it, and I always love a specific reason to go flying. I'm maintaining currency on several different types of aircraft from 2 different local airports, so it gets tricky sometimes to keep up. For the first flight, I was due to fly 172 from my local home base at Toronto Island, a Class C control zone, and my buddy was due to fly out of Burlington Airport, a local uncontrolled airport, in a Piper, which I also fly, and I was due for my monthly flight. He lives closer to Burlington, so I planned to fly out there and meet him with the 172 from Toronto, and then ride along and swap seats for a quick local flight in the Piper. He doesn't have as much experience in controlled airspace as I do, so he opted to drive down, pick me up, and carpool to Toronto to ride along in the 172 for the flight to Burlington, where we'd park the 172, then we'd fly the Piper for a few circuits each, then return the Piper, and I'd fly us back to Toronto in the 172. You still with me? All this to say, it was a relatively complicated plan in terms of logistics, but the distance wasn't far, the weather was supposed to remain good VFR, so it seemed like a fun thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. The flight outbound was completely routine and uneventful, and I expected the same for the return trip home. The only potential problem for the day was lake effect snow streamers, or squalls, from the north. There are some big bodies of water north of Toronto, and the wind was pretty strong from the north, but the initial weather briefing assured me that the streamers wouldn't make it as far south as Toronto, and on the outbound flight I confirmed that that seemed to be the case. Weather was beautiful and clear. It's worth noting that lake effect snow is a very localized phenomenon, and oftentimes on lake effect days you can have beautiful flying anywhere, specifically upwind of lakes, but downwind of lakes you really can get some pretty nasty weather in very localized pockets. Upon arrival to Burlington, it seemed only fair to let my buddy take the first turn in the left seat of the Piper, so I rode along and enjoyed the view. Visibility and sky conditions were still great, as you can see. However, after the first or second circuit, it occurred to me while we were on the downwind leg that visibility toward Toronto had definitely dropped, and the city was now fully obscured. And then an aircraft arriving from the east also reported that conditions were degrading. So when my buddy finished logging his time, I decided to delay my flight in the Piper and recheck the weather for the return flight. I called the local flight service station for a briefing and found that my suspicions were correct, and the north wind had picked up, and there was a solid streamer making its way to Toronto after all. There was a good amount of snow activity, but the briefer assured me that the viz was expected to stay greater than 5 miles, not something I'd ever really want to fly in, even though it's legal, and the ceiling was supposed to stay above 2,000. At this point, I scrubbed my flight in the Piper, which was okay because they actually enforce a 60-day currency in Burlington if you have more than 150 hours total time. But I still like to stay with a personal minimum of a 30-day currency on each type that I fly, if I can. So regarding personal minimums, I also have personal weather minimums for cross-country flying. Those are 6 miles visibility and 3,000-foot ceilings, wind gusts not above 20 knots. So in this case, I was already suddenly below my personal weather minimums. The decision should have been a simple no-go. If I were at home and this was to be a local fun flight, I'd not even be considering taking off in 5-mile visibility with 2,000-foot ceilings. Just not a fun kind of condition to fly in. But I wasn't home, and my buddy's car was stranded at the other airport. This is a classic get-there-itis or get-home-itis type situation. But it was so easy to try to rationalize. It was only 23 miles away, a 13-minute flight. Viz still looked great here in Burlington, and was forecast to stay legal in Toronto. So I decided to test my personal minimums and go for it with relative confidence. It really hadn't occurred to me that it could continue to get worse in the short window of the return flight, but it did. Here are the METARs and the species that were being issued while I was flying. Pause the video if you want to decode these, but the bottom line is 3 species got issued within the space of 1 hour because things were changing and degrading relatively quickly. And here's the radar showing what was happening. A super localized lake effect snow streamer was parked right over Toronto. So I blissfully took off into this relatively clear sky in Burlington. But things were changing pretty fast. Even though I'd gotten a weather briefing just minutes before departure, the snow squall was definitely thickening up and moving further south, and I was heading straight for it. I don't usually look at the radar while I'm flying on my phone, but now that we have these tools on board, especially with ForeFlight and so on, you really can get some pretty amazing real-time information, just even for basic VFR flying. And I've got a little app that lets me see radar in real time, and if I had done that, I may have changed my mind en route because I would have had more accurate real-time information. And as you can see, this radar now is quite different than it was in the morning. So I still had the picture in my head of the snow squalls being way up further north. I just really couldn't have imagined that they were going to be that thick that far south toward Toronto. This flight took place early on in my GoPro flying. I didn't have the intercom audio sorted out at that point, and I also mismanaged the batteries trying to shoot the flights in both the 172 and the Piper. But honestly, I was mostly concerned with getting footage from my buddy in the Piper. I wasn't as concerned about shooting my totally routine flight in the 172. So this is also a great lesson, just to remind yourself that no flight is routine. You should always expect the unexpected, and that lesson is not lost on me here. But anyway, unfortunately my view cam actually died on the way home, so I didn't get footage of the last bit of this flight where it really started to get scary. I still have a bit of the view from the other camera which I was using to shoot the instruments, but I sure wish I had the other angle to review just how bad the visibility got. But I have enough information and the landmarks were really clear in what I did get, so I was able to put together a pretty cool animation to trace the last bit of the flight. We had flight following for the bulk of this flight, and visibility was initially acceptable. But the snow intensity was increasing and the ceiling ended up dropping down to about 1,700 feet. My plan was to fly home at 2,000. As we were handed off to the Toronto Island Tower, conditions degraded relatively quickly. I contacted the tower before getting itis, as I was starting to get distracted that my 2,000 feet was no longer working. At this point we were about 10 miles away, so I descended to 1,500 feet and the visibility seemed to stay the same or get slightly worse at about 2 miles. I asked the tower for an update on visibility and he said they were reporting 3 miles. I made it clear that I didn't think I had that kind of visibility at 1,500 feet. Of course, this is when the view cam battery died, but using these landmarks here, the breakwater and that marina further up ahead, I was able to analyze and post here that my estimate of less than 3 mile viz was pretty accurate, and it did continue to drop as we got closer. Here's the audio that I pulled off liveatc.net. Sorry about the quality.
Hey, City Tower, can I just get an update on your visibility? I'm at 1,500 feet and it looks like I'm at 2 miles here.
Yeah, I'm showing 3 miles.
Yeah, I'm going to descend to 15.
I love that last bit, how I'm kind of trailing off when I'm talking about descending to 15 when I'm already at 15. That's clearly a VFR guy that's bit off more than he can chew, because I knew I couldn't go any lower. I seriously considered doing a 180 when we were about 6 miles away, when the viz dropped to what I estimated was less than 2 miles, under a murky, undefined ceiling of 1,500 feet. At this point, I was almost over my neighborhood, so the landmarks were very familiar, and it was of great help that I knew the shoreline would take me straight to the airport, and that gave me a sense of security. But that's not really something you can take to the bank when you're risking flying VFR into IMC. Now, to be clear, as far as where my head was at in terms of risk assessment, part of my decision to press on was that I knew I had clear air not far behind me, and I was confident that if I hit a wall of snow and suddenly found myself in total IMC conditions, I could transition to instruments, execute the emergency 180 turn while informing ATC, and I'd make it back into clear air within relatively short order. But I can't deny the fact that get-there-itis or get-home-itis was also a significant part of the decision to press on. My buddy was looking at nothing but white to his right and out front, so I know he was a little more nervous than I was. So there were definitely a few adrenaline-filled moments while we weighed our options. And a good note to bring up at this point is that when you do fly with a pilot buddy, you've got to make sure you have a good relationship and a good dynamic, and that you don't find yourself in a situation where you end up both being passengers. My buddy took that opportunity at that point to remind me that he was deferring to me as PIC to make that 180 decision. because I do have a little bit more experience than he does, and I was PIC. But I was close to making that 180. I kept track of the shoreline, but didn't see any part of the airport until less than 2 miles away. And just as I was almost losing hope, the airport came into view. And even then, I only saw part of runway 08. It was pretty weird not to be able to see the whole field. So it is actually pretty cool to analyze in context like this, looking down at it with a graphic. And in terms of the chart, when you've got less than 2 miles viz, this is how much of the chart you're seeing out your window. So if you can imagine being somewhere where landmarks weren't obvious, I mean, forget it. Dead reckoning is just not possible. So yeah, visibility was so poor that I couldn't even see the other end of a 4,000-foot runway when I was a mile or two away. It would have been nice to be able to land straight in on that eastbound runway that I was looking at, but I knew the wind was really strong from the north, and the tower confirmed that, reporting 320 at 18, gusting 25, which was much higher than was forecast, which explains why the snow had come this far south. So landing with that kind of a crosswind was not going to be an option on 08. So I was cleared to the downwind for runway 33. It was pretty creepy to make that turn and face out toward the water, looking at nothing but white out the front window. And I flew one heck of a tight circuit, keeping that airport in sight out my left window. In my turn final, I dumped full flaps and flew one heck of a steep approach just to get her down. This view here, you can see a little tiny bit of the runway there once I get onto final. So it wasn't until I was on short final that I could see the buildings starting to come through the snow just north of the airport there. So the snow was actually continuing to thicken up as I was flying, and I had no intentions of missing this landing. And despite the 15 gusting 25, it was actually one of the better landings I've done in a while.
I think that's safe to say that may have been the worst visibility I've ever been in without actually being in cockpit.
So I'd be lying if I didn't admit that as I was taxiing back, I realized that my feet were shaking on the rudder pedals a little bit. I was definitely happy to be on the ground after this one. Once the engine sound was a bit quieter, you can kind of hear some of our conversation about it. I'll let that play at the end here after my disclaimer. After getting the plane parked, I called the flight service station to file the following PIREP. They were pretty happy to receive it because it was becoming clear that things were changing fast and the actual weather was not being reflected in the reports. So if you made it to the end, I really appreciate you watching. This was actually probably the hardest video that I've had to make. It was the most work I've put into editing one of these things, and I also sat on this footage for almost a year just trying to figure out how and if I even wanted to share this. But I think at the end of the day, this is the kind of thing that is worth sharing. Ironically, it was actually a confidence builder for me to get through it, but it definitely inspired me to get into IFR training. I still intend to fly for fun and mostly in fair weather. I don't intend to fly an actual IMC much once I do get my instrument rating, if I manage to pull it off, because it seems like an insurmountable task still, even though I'm getting through the training. But whether you want to fly for fun or whether you've been flying for a long time, I'd recommend that you get up there with an instructor and do some actual IMC flying, do some additional instrument training. Even if you have no intentions of getting your instrument rating, just get yourself some instrument experience and build some confidence so you know you can handle it if it happens. So anyway, I'm just a private pilot, been flying for a long time, but I don't fly tons, so every flight I try to get as much as I can out of it. I make these videos for my own self-analysis purposes, and I'm happy to share. For more virtual ride-along flying videos like this, please subscribe, and keep on keeping your flight chops sharp, guys.
That was awesome. All right. That was a good flight today. Like, we all got something out of it.
Did we ever?
This was not forecast, man. Yeah, city grounded Julia Sierra off at Bravo 333, looking at taxi back to Hangar 4. Julia Sierra, thanks, have a good day. Oh, that was good. If that airport wasn't any closer, yeah, we would have been flying back to Burlington. Telling the wives we're stranded, cars are their cars downtown. So I was on the level with him saying, I ain't got 3 miles, dude. Yeah. And I think he was nice enough to be cool about it and give me some support. But yeah, I was having a hard time transitioning to full instruments because I didn't want to lose my positional awareness. Right. But I was trying to do both. I don't know what the best move in that case is, but I needed to know the airport's right there. I'm not going to lose my attitude. Airport's right there. Attitude. But I mean, the reality is I had no horizon. All I could see was airport. Right. No horizon. Like that way, no horizon. Right. Yeah, that was intense, man. Look at the snow now, eh?
Cool. All right, Captain.
Yeah. I was right where you were though, like seconds away from a 180. Seconds away. It's awesome.